The air inside the Grand Athenaeum Auditorium felt thick, heavy with the weight of 1,000 dreams and just as many disappointments. It was a strange mix, a smell of expensive perfume clinging to velvet seats, the dusty scent of old curtains, and the faint electric tang of nervous sweat. Tonight was the final qualifying round of the National Vocal Showcase, the kind of show that promised to turn an ordinary person into a star overnight. The audience was a sea of expectant faces, all lit by the glow of the stage lights, their eyes fixed on the platform where futures were made or broken. One by one, they had come. A woman in a shimmering silver dress who hit notes so high they felt like they could crack glass. A man with a slicked-back hairstyle and a charming smile who sang a romantic ballad and made half the audience sigh. They were all good. In fact, they were all great. They were polished, practiced, and perfect. They knew exactly how to stand, how to smile at the right moment, how to pour every ounce of their training into a performance that was technically flawless. But for one man sitting at the long, polished judge's table, it was all becoming incredibly boring. His name was Julian Croft, and he was a legend in the music world, though a tired one. He had seen it all. He'd discovered stars, he'd seen them burn out, and he'd listened to thousands of voices that, while impressive, all started to sound the same after a while. They were voices trained to perfection, stripped of any rough edges, any unique imperfections that might make them truly interesting. He leaned back in his chair, the expensive fabric of his suit rustling softly. He tapped his pen on the desk, a slow, rhythmic beat that counted down the minutes until he could go home. He was looking for something real, something raw and honest, but he had a sinking feeling he wouldn't find it here. Not on this glittering stage, in this carefully manufactured competition. Then the host's voice boomed through the hall, announcing the next contestant. And now, please welcome to the stage, Anya Petrova. A small figure shuffled out from the wings. She was so different from the others who had come before her. The other contestants had walked with a confident stride, owning the stage the moment they stepped onto it. Anya seemed to be trying to make herself smaller, to disappear into the bright lights. She was 19, but she looked younger, with mousy brown hair pulled back into a simple bun that was already starting to fall apart. A few stray strands stuck to her damp forehead. She wore a dress that was a faded blue color, a simple cotton thing that looked like it had seen better days. It was a little too big for her, hanging loosely on her slight frame, and the hem was slightly frayed. On her feet were a pair of plain, scuffed black shoes that looked like they had walked a very long way to get here. She stood at the center of the massive stage, looking lost. The lights were hot, and she could feel a bead of sweat trickle down her back. The auditorium was so big, so empty, and she felt like a tiny, insignificant speck in the middle of it all. Out in the crowd, people started to whisper. She didn't look like a star. She looked like a girl who had gotten lost on her way to the library. The host, sensing the awkward silence, walked over to her with a practiced, bright smile. Anya, it's a pleasure to have you. Tell everyone at home, what are you going to be singing for us tonight? Anya flinched slightly at the sound of his voice, which was so loud and confident. She leaned towards the microphone, her hands clutching the stand so tightly her knuckles were white. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, a thin, reedy sound that was almost swallowed by the vastness of the room. It was laced with a heavy, rolling accent from a distant, rural part of the country that marked her as an outsider. The old mountain lullaby, sir," she said, her voice trembling just a little. "From my village?" The host gave a polite nod, though you could tell he had no idea what she was talking about. He was used to people naming famous pop songs or classic opera pieces. A mountain lullaby. How wonderful. We look forward to it. He gave her one last bright smile and then retreated to the side of the stage. Anya was left alone under the glare of the lights. She could feel the eyes of the thousands of people in the audience, and most importantly, the eyes of the judges. She dared a quick glance at the long table. Two of the judges were smiling politely, but her eyes found Julian Croft. He wasn't smiling. He was looking at his watch, a flicker of impatience on his face. Then he looked up at her, and as she opened her mouth to whisper a small, nervous, "Thank you," into the microphone. He did it. He rolled his eyes. It wasn't a big, dramatic gesture. It was small, quick, and dismissive. It was a look that said, "I've heard this 1,000 times before." The authentic folk singer who is really just untrained and unprepared. This is going to be a waste of everyone's time. It was a look of pure, unadulterated cynicism. High above the stage, a large screen showed a close-up of the judge's table for the millions of people watching at home. The camera caught it perfectly. The eye roll was broadcast to the entire country. Anya saw it. For a split second, their eyes met, and she saw the contempt in his. It felt like a physical blow, a punch to the stomach. A wave of hot shame washed over her. He was right. Who was she to be here? She didn't belong on this stage with these beautiful, talented people. She was just a girl from a small village in the mountains, singing a simple song her grandmother had taught her. She wanted to run. She wanted to turn around, shuffle back into the wings, and disappear forever. The music director in the pit gave her a questioning look, waiting for her cue. The audience was quiet, a low hum of whispers filling the air. Anya stood there, frozen, the judge's dismissal echoing in her ears. But then she took a deep breath. She thought about why she had come here. She thought about her grandmother, whose voice was as weathered and beautiful as the mountains themselves. She thought about the song and the stories it held, the feeling of home it gave her. She closed her eyes, shutting out the imposing hall, the silent audience, and the sneering judge. She blocked out the lights, the cameras, and the feeling of being an imposter. In the darkness of her own mind, she was no longer on a stage in a big city. She was back home, sitting by a warm fire, with the cold, crisp air of the mountains just outside the door. She took another breath, a slow, deep breath that seemed to draw all the air from the room. And in the silence of her own making, she prepared to let the song out. The silence in the Grand Athenaeum Auditorium stretched, thin and tense, like a wire pulled to its breaking point. Anya stood with her eyes closed, a small, fragile statue in the center of the vast, empty stage. The audience members leaned forward in their seats, a sea of curious faces. Some were whispering to their neighbors, their words a soft rustle like dry leaves. Others were just waiting, their expressions a mixture of pity and impatience. They had come for a show, for spectacle, and this girl, with her faded dress and trembling hands, seemed to promise nothing but a disappointing interlude. At the judge's table, Julian Croft had already picked up his pen, ready to jot down a few dismissive notes. "Lacks projection," he might write. "Untrained, emotionally disconnected." He had seen this story play out too many times. The raw talent that was just too raw, the diamond in the rough that was in reality just a common stone. He settled back, preparing to endure the next few minutes. Then Anya sang. The first note was not a gentle beginning. It was not a soft, tentative sound that grew in volume. It was an eruption. It was a sonic earthquake that seemed to originate from the very floorboards of the old auditorium. It was a voice of impossible power and depth, a resonant, soul-shaking baritone that was so completely at odds with her small frame and her reedy speaking voice that it felt like a miracle, or a trick. The sound wasn't just heard. It was felt. It was a physical force that vibrated through the solace of people's shoes, up the legs of their chairs and into the marrow of their bones. It was a sound that seemed to carry the weight of mountains, the chill of deep winters, and the echoes of ancient sorrows. It was a sound so pure and so profound that it silenced every whisper, every cough, every rustle of a program in an instant. For a single, breathtaking moment, the entire auditorium was frozen in a state of pure, unadulterated shock. The effect on the judges was immediate and dramatic. The woman on the end, a famous pop singer known for her bubbly personality, dropped her pen. It clattered onto the polished desk, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden silence, but no one even flinched. Her mouth was slightly agape, her perfectly painted lips frozen in a circle of disbelief. The judge next to her, a distinguished composer with silver hair, slowly pushed his glasses up his nose, his eyes wide as he stared at the stage as if seeing a ghost, But the most telling reaction came from Julian Croft. His pen, which had been poised to write a scathing critique, slipped from his fingers. It didn't just fall. It was ejected from his hand as if by an invisible force. It bounced once on the desk and then clattered to the floor, but he didn't notice. His body, which had been slouched in an attitude of bored indifference, was now ramrod straight. The cynical sneer had been wiped from his face, replaced by an expression of wide-eyed, utter astonishment. His eyes, which had been rolling with contempt just moments before, were now fixed on Anya, unblinking. He looked like a man who had spent his life studying the colors of the rainbow and had just seen a new color for the first time. The look on his face was not just surprise. It was a kind of intellectual and emotional vertigo, the feeling of his entire understanding of the world being shattered in a single, impossible moment. And then, as the initial shock of that first note began to recede, the true beauty of her voice revealed itself. The raw, volcanic power was still there, but now it was channeled. The song, the old mountain lullaby, was a simple melody. It wasn't complex or technically demanding. It was a tune that had been sung for generations, a song to soothe crying babies and to ease the burdens of a long day's work. But in Anya's voice it became something more. It became a story. Her voice could soar like an eagle over a snow-capped peak, filling the highest corners of the auditorium with a sound so clear and piercing it brought tears to the eyes. Then, in the next breath, it could soften into a whisper so intimate and so full of quiet sorrow that it felt like she was singing each person's private grief directly to them. She sang of the wind that howled through the pines, and you could almost hear the whistle of the air through the needles. She sang of the cold, clear streams that flowed down from the mountains, and you could feel the chill of the water. She sang of loneliness and of hope, of loss and of resilience. Every note was infused with a depth of emotion that felt authentic, lived in. This wasn't a performance. It was a confession. It was a piece of her soul laid bare for everyone to see. The audience, which had been so dismissive just moments before, was now completely captivated. People who had been checking their phones now stared, transfixed. A man in the third row, who had come with his wife only because she had an extra ticket, found a lump forming in his throat. A young woman in the balcony who dreamed of being a singer herself felt a shiver of inspiration and awe run down her spine. The entire room was under a spell, held captive by a voice that was both ancient and new, both powerful and vulnerable. Anya herself seemed to change as she sang. The timid, frightened girl who had shuffled onto the stage was gone. In her place was a woman who was completely connected to her music, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm, her face expressive and alive. Her eyes were still closed, but now it wasn't out of fear. It was out of concentration, out of a deep internal focus. She was no longer in the Grand Athenaeum Auditorium. She was back in her village, and she was singing for her grandmother, for the mountains, for herself. The faded dress and scuffed shoes no longer mattered. The only thing that mattered was the song, and the voice that was giving it life. As the final note of the lullaby faded into the air, it didn't just end. It seemed to hang there for a moment, a fragile, shimmering thing in the vast silence of the hall. And then the silence broke. It wasn't a gradual buildup of applause. It was an explosion. A single person in the front row leaped to their feet, clapping wildly, and it was like a spark in a dry forest. The sound spread like wildfire through the entire auditorium. Within seconds, everyone was on their feet. The applause was deafening, a roar of approval that shook the very foundations of the building. People were shouting "Bravo!" and "Encore!" their faces flushed with excitement and emotion. They were not just clapping for a good performance. They were clapping because they had just witnessed something extraordinary, something they would never forget. They had come to see a competition, and they had seen a miracle instead. And on that stage, in the center of the storm of sound, stood Anya, her eyes finally opening, a look of dazed surprise on her face as she took in the sight of thousands of people standing and cheering just for her. The roar in the Grand Athenaeum Auditorium was a living thing. It was a physical force, a wall of sound that crashed over the stage and threatened to sweep Anya away. For a long moment, she just stood there, her eyes wide with a dazed confusion that was clear even to the people in the cheapest seats at the very back. The sea of faces was a blur, 1,000 mouths open, 1,000 hands clapping in a frantic, joyful rhythm. The lights, which had felt so oppressive before, now seemed like a warm embrace, illuminating the storm of approval that she had unknowingly created. She had never imagined anything like this. In her village, a good song was met with a few nods, a quiet, well done, and maybe a request to sing it again. This was something else entirely. This was the sound of 1,000 hearts being touched all at once. A slow, uncertain smile began to form on her lips, a fragile thing that seemed out of place in the midst of such a powerful display. She took a small, awkward bow, her movements clumsy and unrehearsed, and the crowd just roared louder, as if her very awkwardness was part of what they loved. At the judges' table, the scene was just as chaotic, but much quieter. The female pop star judge was wiping tears from her eyes with the back of her hand, her professional composure completely shattered. I don't know what to say, she stammered into her microphone, her voice thick with emotion. That was pure magic. The distinguished composer was shaking his head slowly, a look of reverent awe on his face. The control, the depth. It's a voice that comes along once in a generation, perhaps once in a lifetime. They both turned to the third judge, the man whose opinion now carried more weight than anyone else's. Julian Croft was still as a statue. He hadn't moved a muscle since the first note had shattered the room. His pen was still on the floor, forgotten. His gaze was locked on Anya, who was now standing in the center of the stage, looking like a lost child who had accidentally wandered into a celebration. The other judges fell silent, waiting for him to speak. The entire auditorium seemed to hold its breath, the applause softening to a low, expectant hum. Finally, Julian leaned forward, his movements slow and deliberate. He straightened his tie, a familiar, habitual gesture, but his hands were trembling slightly. He looked directly into the camera, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he leaned into his microphone. The auditorium went completely silent. I have spent 30 years of my life in this business, he began, his voice low and gravelly, but it carried an authority that commanded absolute attention. 30 years listening to the human voice. I have heard the most technically perfect singers in the world. I have heard voices that are like finely tuned instruments, flawless and beautiful. And I have become bored. I have become cynical because I thought I had heard it all. I thought every new sound was just an echo of an old one. He paused, his eyes finding Anya's on the stage. I was wrong. What you just did was not a performance. It was not a song. It was an event. It was like hearing the earth sing for the first time. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Your voice doesn't just sing notes, he continued, his voice gaining a slight tremor of passion. It tells stories. It remembers things. It remembers the cold of the mountains and the warmth of a fire. It remembers loneliness and it remembers love. It is an unfiltered, unpolished, and brutally honest sound. And it is the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. He stopped, and for the first time that night, a small, genuine smile touched his lips. Thank you for reminding me why I fell in love with music in the first place. The moment the show ended, the world outside the auditorium exploded. Inside the venue, people were already on their phones, their fingers flying across the screens. The clip of Anya's performance, paired with the earlier clip of Julian rolling his eyes, began to spread like a digital wildfire. It was the perfect story, the underdog, the cynical judge, the shocking reversal. Within an hour, the mountain girl who shattered the silence was the #1 trending topic everywhere. News sites that had never covered the competition before were suddenly running headlines about the viral sensation and the voice of a generation. People who had never heard of the National Vocal Showcase were now sharing the video, commenting on the raw emotion, the incredible power, and the look of pure shock on the judge's face. It was a cultural moment happening in real time, and Anya, the girl at the center of it all, was completely unaware, backstage, The noise of the crowd was a distant echo, replaced by a different kind of chaos. The moment Anya stepped off the stage, she was surrounded. People with headsets and clipboards moved with a sense of urgent purpose. A woman with a kind face handed her a bottle of water, while a man with a very bright smile was already talking at her a mile a minute. Anya, that was incredible. Just incredible. I'm a producer with the show, and let me tell you, we have never seen anything like it. Never. He was a whirlwind of energy, his suit expensive and his teeth impossibly white. The phones are ringing off the hook. Record labels, talent agents, morning shows. Everyone wants a piece of you. Anya just clutched the water bottle, nodding dumbly. She was still trying to process the fact that she had sung a song, and now this man was talking about morning shows. It felt like she had stepped through a doorway into another world. The producer, whose name was Richard, guided her through the maze of corridors and cables. "We need to think about your next song for the finals," he said, his mind clearly racing ahead. "Something with a bit more pop appeal. We can't just do folk songs, you know? We need to show your range, your marketability." The word marketability hung in the air, a strange and slightly cold word that Anya didn't quite understand. He led her into a small, sterile dressing room and gestured for her to sit. "We have a team of the best stylists, the best vocal coaches. We're going to polish you up, make you into a star. You have the raw talent, the authentic feel, which is great. It's a fantastic brand. But we need to package it. We need to make it shine." He smiled again, but this time the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. It was the smile of a businessman who had just found a very valuable product. Anya sat on the small chair, looking at her reflection in the brightly lit mirror. The girl staring back at her was still the same girl from the mountains. Her hair was still messy, her dress was still faded, and her face was still pale and smudged with a bit of stage dust. But the world, it seemed, saw something else entirely. They saw a phenomenon. They saw a brand. They saw a star waiting to be made. The producer was still talking, laying out a future that was glittering and exciting, but also felt terrifyingly out of her control. He was talking about photo shoots and interviews, about changing her image and refining her sound. He was talking about taming the very thing that the judge on stage had called a force of nature. Anya looked at her own hands, the same hands that had held her grandmother's as she learned the old lullaby. She had wanted to share her voice, to share a piece of her home, but she was beginning to realize that by letting the world hear it, she might have given up the right to decide what it would become. The applause had faded, the shock was wearing off, and in its place was a new, much more complicated feeling, the chilling realization that she had won the battle, but the war for her own soul was just beginning. The next few days passed in a blur of motion and noise, a whirlwind that Anya felt she had no control over. She was swept from one appointment to the next, a passive passenger in her own suddenly extraordinary life. The small, quiet room she was given in a fancy hotel felt less like a home and more like a holding pen, a place where she was kept between sessions of being remolded into someone else. The first and most obvious change was her appearance. A team of stylists descended on her like a flock of brightly colored birds. They clucked and fussed over her, their hands constantly in her hair, their fingers pinching and prodding at the fabric of new clothes. Her faded blue dress, the one she had felt so comfortable in, was whisked away and replaced by a series of outfits that were beautiful but felt like costumes. There was a sleek, silver gown that was so tight she could barely breathe, and a pair of high heels that made her ankles wobble with every step. They straightened her hair and styled it into an elegant, complicated updo that felt heavy and unnatural on her head. When she looked in the mirror, she saw a stranger staring back at her, a polished, glamorous woman who looked like she belonged on a magazine cover, but who wasn't her. It was like looking at a photograph of someone else wearing her face, but the changes to her voice were even more unsettling. The vocal coach, a stern woman with a sharp voice and an even sharper ruler, was tasked with refining her technique. "Your diction is a bit rustic," the coach would say, tapping her ruler against a music stand. "And your vibrato is uncontrolled. We need to smooth it out. Make it more commercial. They would spend hours doing scales and exercises, trying to erase the very accents and imperfections that made her voice unique. They wanted to sand down the rough edges, to polish the weathered stone until it was smooth and generic. Anya tried to follow their instructions, she really did. But every time they tried to correct a note, she felt a pang of loss, as if a small piece of her grandmother's legacy was being erased. The biggest challenge came with the song for the finale. Richard, the producer, had chosen it for her. It was a generic pop ballad, the kind that was played on the radio all the time. It had a simple, catchy melody and lyrics about love and heartbreak that were so vague they could have been about anyone. "This is the one," Richard had said, beaming with confidence. "It's a surefire hit. It will show everyone that you're not just a one-trick pony. You can be a pop star?" Anya looked at the sheet music and felt her heart sink. The notes were there, the words were there, but the soul was missing. There was no story of the mountains, no echo of the wind, no hint of the ancient sorrow that lived in her voice. It was just a collection of pretty sounds. The rehearsals were a special kind of torture. Anya would stand on the practice stage, surrounded by musicians and technicians, and sing the pop ballad. Her voice, now trained and polished, hit all the right notes. It was technically perfect, but it was empty. She felt like a puppet, singing words she didn't feel and melodies she didn't believe in. The fire, the raw, untamed power that had captivated the auditorium, was gone, smothered under layers of expectation and production. During one rehearsal, they played back a recording of her performance through the large speakers on the wall. Anya watched herself on a monitor, a glamorous, well-dressed woman singing a song with a perfectly pleasant voice. And she felt nothing. There was no connection, no emotion. It was like watching a commercial for a product she had no interest in buying. A wave of despair washed over her, so cold and deep it made her shiver. She was losing herself. She was becoming the product that Richard wanted her to be, and in the process, the voice that was truly hers was disappearing. She was sitting alone in the rehearsal studio later that day, staring at the sheet music as if the notes might magically rearrange themselves into something meaningful, when she heard a soft cough behind her. She turned to see Julian Croft standing in the doorway. He wasn't wearing his judge's suit, but a simple, dark coat, and he looked less like a famous critic and more like just a man. For a moment, they were both silent. Anya felt a flush of embarrassment, as if he had caught her doing something wrong. "Mr. Croft?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. "What are you doing here?" He walked into the room, his eyes scanning the music on the stand. "I heard what they were having you sing," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I wanted to see if it was true." He picked up the sheet music, looked at it for a moment, and then let it fall back onto the stand with a soft sigh. "This is not your song?" Anya looked down at her hands, twisting a loose thread on her expensive new blouse. "It's what they want," she mumbled. "They say it's what the people want to hear." Julian pulled up a chair and sat down opposite her. He didn't smile. He just looked at her with an intensity that was both intimidating and strangely comforting. "Let me tell you something about the music business," he said. "They are always trying to put things in neat little boxes. They hear a voice like yours and they don't know what to do with it. It's too big, too wild, too real. So they try to tame it. They try to put it in a box and label it marketable. They're trying to turn a force of nature into a decorative fountain. It might look pretty, but it has no power. It can't carve canyons or shape landscapes." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "They will break you, because what you have cannot be contained. It cannot be packaged and sold. Don't let them." His words hit her with the force of a physical blow. It was as if he had reached into her heart and given a name to the fear and sadness she had been feeling. He understood. He was the only one who seemed to understand. He wasn't talking about marketability or hit songs. He was talking about her soul. "But what am I supposed to do?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and a dawning hope. "I have to sing something in the finale." Julian stood up and walked to the door. Before he left, he turned back to her. "You already know what you have to sing?" he said. Then he was gone, leaving Anya alone in the quiet room with his words echoing in her mind. She looked at the generic pop ballad on the music stand, and then she closed her eyes. In her mind, she could hear the wind in the pines. She could feel the cold, clear water of the mountain stream. And she could hear the melody of the old lullaby. The song that was a part of her, the song that was truly hers. A slow, quiet resolve began to form in her heart. She had a choice to make. She could be the decorative fountain, or she could be the force of nature. And she suddenly knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones which one she was meant to be. The night of the finale felt different from the first time she had been on that stage. The air in the Grand Athenaeum Auditorium was still thick with anticipation, but now it was mixed with a new kind of energy. The show was being broadcast live across the country, and everyone was waiting to see if the mountain girl could do it again. Backstage, the chaos was at a fever pitch. Hair and makeup teams buzzed around Anya like bees, putting the final touches on her transformation. She was dressed in a glittering silver gown that sparkled under the harsh backstage lights. It was a beautiful dress, but it felt like a suit of armor, stiff and cold against her skin. Her hair was swept up in an intricate style, and her face was painted with makeup that felt thick and heavy. She looked like a star, but she felt like a mannequin in a shop window. Richard, the producer, was pacing back and forth, his phone pressed to his ear. "Everything is perfect," he said, giving Anya a thumbs up. "The band is ready, the lighting is set. This is going to be huge. Just remember what we practiced. Hit the high notes, smile for the camera, and you'll walk away with this thing." He gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder, but his touch felt impersonal, like he was patting a prize-winning horse. Anya just nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She felt a knot of cold dread in her stomach. She was about to go out in front of millions of people and sing a song that meant nothing to her. She was about to betray the very thing that had brought her here. Then a stagehand with a headset called her name. "That's you, Anya. You're on in 2 minutes." The words sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. This was it. The moment of truth. As she walked towards the stage entrance, she could hear the host's voice booming through the auditorium, introducing her. "And now, the moment you've all been waiting for. The voice that has captured a nation. The incredible, the unforgettable, Anya Petrova." The crowd erupted in a roar of applause. Anya took a deep breath, the smell of dust and electricity filling her lungs. She thought of Julian's words echoing in her mind. "They are trying to turn a force of nature into a decorative fountain." She stepped out of the wings and into the blinding light. The stage was even bigger than she remembered. The audience was a vast, dark sea, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phones. She walked to the center mark, the high heels making her feel unsteady. The music for the pop ballad began to play, a slick, synthesized melody that felt completely alien to her. Anya stood there, the microphone in her hand, and looked out at the thousands of people. She saw Richard in the wings, giving her an encouraging nod. She saw the judges, their faces expectant. And she saw a camera pointed directly at her, its red light a tiny, unblinking eye. In that moment, she knew she couldn't do it. She couldn't sing that song. She couldn't be the person they wanted her to be. She raised a hand, a small, simple gesture that was almost lost in the vastness of the stage. "Stop," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but it was picked up by the microphone and sent through the speakers. The music cut off abruptly, leaving a sudden, shocked silence in the auditorium. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. In the wings, Richard's face went pale. He started gesturing wildly, mouthing words she couldn't understand. But Anya didn't look at him. She looked out at the audience, at the millions of people watching at home. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice a little stronger now. "This isn't my song. This isn't my voice." Another wave of whispers, louder this time. The other judges on the panel looked at each other, their expressions a mixture of confusion and annoyance. She was breaking the rules, live on national television. Anya took another deep breath, the kind of breath she took before singing her grandmother's lullaby. She closed her eyes, shutting out the lights, the cameras, and the expectations. "I'm going to sing a different song," she said. It's an old mountain lullaby. It's the only song I know how to sing with my heart." And then she began to sing. The first note was just as powerful as it had been the first time, a resonant, soul-shaking sound that filled the auditorium. But this time it was different. It was infused with a new depth of emotion. It wasn't just the sound of the mountains anymore. It was the sound of her struggle, her pain, and her defiance. It was a voice that had been pushed down and was now rising up, stronger and more determined than ever. The song was the same simple melody, but the story it told was different now. It was a story of a girl who had been lost in a big, confusing world and had found her way back home. It was a story of reclaiming a part of herself that she had almost given away. She sang. She opened her eyes. She looked directly at the judge's table, her gaze finding Julian. He was watching her, a look of profound understanding on his face. She sang for him, a silent thank you for his words of wisdom. She sang for her grandmother, for the mountains, and for the part of her that was wild and free. The performance was not just technically perfect. It was emotionally raw and brutally honest. It was the most real thing anyone in that room had ever heard. When she finished, the final note hung in the air for a moment, a fragile, shimmering sound in the vast silence. There was no explosion of applause this time. There was a stunned, reverent silence, as if the entire audience was holding its breath. They had just witnessed something more than a performance. They had witnessed an act of pure, unadulterated courage. Then, a single person in the front row began to clap. It was a slow, deliberate sound. Then another person joined in, and another. Soon, the entire auditorium was filled with a thunderous applause, a roar of approval that was even louder than the first time. It was an applause not just for a beautiful voice, but for a brave heart. The judges were on their feet, all except for one. The other two were showering her with praise, but their words seemed to fade into the background. All eyes were on Julian Croft. He remained seated for a long moment, looking at Anya with an expression of deep respect. Then slowly he rose to his feet. He didn't say anything. He just began to clap, a slow, deliberate standing ovation that was more powerful than any words he could have spoken. It was a gesture of profound respect from the one person who understood the true meaning of what she had just done. Anya didn't win the competition that night. The producers, in their desire to maintain control, gave the trophy to one of the other, more manageable contestants. But as she walked off the stage, the sound of the applause still ringing in her ears, she knew she had won something much more important. She had won back her soul. She had proven that the most powerful voice is the one that is true to itself, and that sometimes the greatest victory is not a trophy, but the courage to be who you are.